Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations says 20 million people, 78% of the population, need urgent humanitarian aid in Yemen. That's an increase of 4 million from just 3 months ago. Aid agencies have urged Saudi Arabia to ease a naval blockade, depriving Yemen of basic goods. Saudi Arabia has also failed to hand over any of the $274 million it pledged to the UN Emergency Humanitarian Fund for Yemen in April. The news comes amidst continued fighting between Houthi rebels and rival forces backed by the Saudi-led coalition. On Sunday, dozens of Houthi-allied soldiers were killed in an airstrike in the capital, Sana'a. Saudi Arabia also shot down a Scud missile fired by Houthi forces across the border from Yemen. This comes days after a Saudi airstrike in Sana'a province killed at least 50 people, most of them civilians. President Obama is joining other world leaders in Germany today as the G7 summit comes to a close. Heads of state are holding talks in a secluded resort inside a 100-year-old castle. Outside the summit, protesters have been met by a massive show of police force with as many as 20,000 officers deployed. Thousands of demonstrators took to the streets Saturday in the nearby town of Garmisch. On Sunday, leaders and reporters had to be shuttled to the G7 talks by helicopter after protesters blocked a main road. Issues under discussion include climate change, austerity, Greece's fiscal crisis, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, Russia and Ukraine, and what President Obama called Russian aggression. We'll have more on the G7 summit after headlines. Turkey's ruling party has lost its parliamentary majority in a major defeat for President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The Justice and Development Party, or AKP, still won the most seats but lost legislative control for the first time in 13 years. The result will thwart Erdogan's bid to increase his presidential powers. The pro-Kurdish HDP party won seats for the first time after appealing to Erdogan's leftist and secular opponents. Pakistan has acknowledged it's cleared 8 of the 10 people convicted for the attempted murder of Pakistani education activist Malala Yousafzai. In 2012, Yousafzai was shot in the head by a Taliban gunman who boarded her school bus. She survived serious wounds and now continues to campaign around the world, winning the Nobel Peace Prize last year. In April, Pakistan said 10 men had been sentenced to life imprisonment for the attack, but Pakistan now says 8 of them were actually acquitted due to a lack of evidence. Protests broke out in parts of Mexico Sunday as the country held midterm elections. Both striking teachers and relatives of 43 students missing since last year burned ballots in acts of anti-government unrest. The PRI party of Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto retained its congressional majority, though with a smaller number of seats. Thousands of people have rallied in Honduras calling for the resignation of President Juan Orlando Hernandez over a corruption scandal. The protesters turned out after Hernandez admitted his election campaign received donations from companies linked to Social Security embezzlement.
We are protesting against impunity and corruption. We will not stand for criminalization and insecurity. This country is collapsing. Public enterprise has been disarmed. This government cannot do anything. It must be removed.
The President, Hernandez, has denied any personal involvement in the payments. Saudi Arabia's top court has upheld the controversial verdict against activist Raif Badawi. He was arrested in 2012 after setting up a website for political and social debate. He was sentenced in January to 1,000 lashes and 10 years in prison. 2 people have come forward with specific allegations of child molestation against former House Speaker Denny Hastert. Hastert was indicted last month on federal charges of lying to the FBI and illegally paying $3.5 million to hide alleged misconduct. FBI sources say Hastert was making payments to a former student to conceal sexual abuse that occurred during Hastert's previous career as a high school teacher and coach in Yorkville, Illinois. Now the sister and a classmate of another former student, Stephen Reinbolds, have identified him as at least the second potential victim of Hastert's abuse. The unidentified friend spoke to NBC News.
He started to talk about his relationship with Denny Hastert and told me that they had been sexual, and I was flabbergasted. I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, we would do things sexually, and I would sometimes start with a massage."
Meanwhile, Stephen Reinbolds' sister, Jolene Burge, said she found out when Reinbolds told her he was gay.
I asked him, "Stevie, when was your first same-sex experience. I mean, he just looked at me and said, it was with Dennis Hastert. And I was stunned. I said, why didn't you ever tell anybody, Stevie? I mean, he was your teacher. Why didn't you ever tell anybody? And he just looked at me and said, who is ever going to believe me? In this town, who is ever going to believe me?
Reinbolds died of AIDS in 1995. According to Jolene Burge, Hastert showed up at his brother's funeral. She says she confronted him about the abuse.
He just stood there and stared at me, and then I just continued to say, I want you to know that your secret didn't die in there with my brother, and I want you to remember that I'm out here and that I know.
The former student whom Hastert was paying has not been identified. According to CBS News, authorities believe there could be a third victim. Hastert served as Speaker of the House from 1999 to 2007, making him the longest-serving Republican Speaker in history. Thousands of people marched in St. Paul, Minnesota Saturday in a show of opposition to tar sands pipelines. Organizers focused on calling for the cancellation of the proposed Sandpiper pipeline, which would run near pristine water reserves. Saturday's action is said to be the largest anti-tar sands rally in the Midwest to date. A manhunt is underway here in New York after 2 convicted murderers escaped from a maximum security prison. The prisoners used power tools to drill through the walls and break out of the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. Charles Guess of the New York State Police said the pair may have had help.
We're leaving no stone unturned. It's been approximately 36 hours since these inmates escaped. They could be literally anywhere. Although we have notified our partners in Canada, the ports of entry across the northern border, and certainly every law enforcement agency in the Northeast, they could be out of state, but they still could be holed up here in Dannemora. We do not know if they had access to a vehicle, but we presume that they may have had access to a vehicle, as well as they may have received assistance in their escape effort, if for no other reason, at least outside the secure perimeter of this facility.
It's the first escape from Clinton's maximum security wing in its history. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has declared the manhunt a crisis situation. A Texas police officer has been put on leave after video emerged of him wrestling an African-American teenage girl to the ground, pulling her hair and pulling his gun on another teen. The officer was helping respond to neighbors' complaints about a disturbance at a party the teens were attending at a local pool. Several African-American teenagers in attendance say a dispute only broke out after local white residents voiced anger at their presence. The video appears to show the officer singling out the African-American teenager. The girl he pulled the gun on was wearing a bathing suit. A coroner has ruled the death of a 21-year-old Nigerian native in a Savannah, Georgia jail cell a homicide. Matthew Ajibade died on New Year's Day of what the coroner described as blunt force trauma, including abrasions, lacerations, skin injuries about the head and some other areas of the body. At the time of his death, he was restrained in an isolation cell after authorities said he became combative during an altercation which injured 3 deputies. Last month, 9 Chatham County deputies were fired in connection with his death. Meanwhile, the graphic full video of a Salt Lake City, Utah police officer shooting an unarmed man last summer has been released. The video shows Officer Bron Cruz approaching Dylan Taylor as he walks away from him with headphones in his ears. Cruz shouts at Taylor to get his hands out, then opens fire as Taylor appears to raise his hands.
Hands out now! Get your hands out! Get them out! Shots fired, shots fired. Get me medical here now.
Cruz then handcuffs Taylor and searches his pockets as blood gushes from his chest and abdomen, covering his face. The shooting took place 2 days after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The Salt Lake County District Attorney ruled it justified, saying Officer Cruz, quote, reasonably perceived a threat. An immigrant teenage mom has attempted suicide at a private Texas family detention center after being denied asylum. 19-year-old Lilian Olia Yamileth has sought refuge with her 4-year-old son in the U.S. to escape severe domestic abuse in her native Honduras. But after her bid was denied, she cut her wrist and left a suicide note saying she has been, quote, treated worse than an animal. Doctors say her wound is non-life-threatening. The Carnes facility holds about 500 immigrant women and children. Last week, Carnes released 5 pregnant women just hours after their detention was revealed. A funeral was held on Saturday for Beau Biden, the late son of Vice President Joe Biden. Beau Biden died last week of brain cancer at the age of 46. President Obama delivered the eulogy.
It's no secret that a lot of what made Beau the way he was just how much he loved and admired his dad. He studied law like his dad, even choosing the same law school. He chased public service like his dad, believing it to be a noble and important pursuit. From his dad, he learned how to get back up when life knocked him down. He learned that he was no higher than anybody else and no lower than anybody else.
Here in New York, a young man imprisoned for 3 years at Rikers without charge has committed suicide. Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old high school sophomore when he was detained on suspicion of stealing a backpack. Browder never pleaded guilty and was never convicted. He maintained his innocence and requested a trial, but was only offered plea deals while the trial was repeatedly delayed. After enduring nearly 800 days in solitary confinement and abuses from guards, Khalif Browder was only released when the case was dismissed. Browder died last week at his home in the Bronx. He was 22 years old. We'll have more on the story later in the broadcast. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.